Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, thanks for joining me. I'm Katie, and as requested by a few of you, I'm going to do a comparison of the muted watercolours versus the Derwent graphitint versus some I've mixed up myself. So kick back, relax and enjoy. The first ones I'm going to use are the black watercolours that I got from AliExpress, and I've featured them a few times on this channel. They're a bit like the Kuretake Gansai watercolour paints, but they're not made by Kuretake, and they're weird to paint with, but I really like them, which is why I've used them a few times. To keep this test fair, I have used salt on just one section of each of the pictures, and I've also tried to match the colours up based on this palette rather than the other two experiments I do afterwards. Now, I'd not actually used salt with these paints before, so it was actually quite interesting to see how it would react, and it kind of reacted like watercolour does with salt, and I quite like the texture it left behind. I do tend to find though with these paints it is difficult to get a skin tone which doesn't make the figure look ill, but then I guess it kind of goes with the gloominess of the colour palette, right? I also need to mention as well that the paper I'm using is Archie's Cold Press 300 GSM, and I featured that on the watercolour test video I did a short while back. Now, one thing I've always found with these paints is how smooth they are to apply, and that's either wet on wet or wet on dry, and I think they're really nice to paint with. They work really well with a rigger brush, you get a nice consistent flow, and when you do the wet and wet you get these gorgeous blooms coming through it, and they're quite dramatic, as I'm sure you've seen so far. Another advantage to having a palette like this, and I suppose really I could build my own or you could build your own, but it is just nice to have a restricted palette to work with. Even though that does come with obstacles, I kind of find that when you've got obstacles ahead of you, it's part of developing as an artist to learn how to overcome them and work around it or work them to your advantage. But we're all done. I just added a bit of gel pen for highlights, and that's that. The second contender, which is the Derwent graphitint watercolour pan set. As you can see, they mix completely differently when diluted, and the pigments rise to the top, whereas the graphite tends to sink straight to the bottom. So a word of advice if you're using these is just to keep stirring up your palettes to make sure you've got a good dollop of graphite on there, otherwise it defies the point, right? I managed to match the colours up relatively easily. However, I do have to remember that these are not quite as bold as the others, but they have other qualities instead. I added the salt to it as I do with all of them, and carried on with the skin tones. Now, because I'm matching them up with the AliExpress palette, and that's what I'm going to call it because it's easier to say that, again I had that restriction and I had a rather ill looking character, but that's okay, it's all in keeping. So one of the things I've noticed about the application of this is how that graphite sinks to the bottom, like I mentioned earlier, and it doesn't travel very well, so it looks quite startling. However, because it sort of stays in one place and it's quite easy to move around with a brush, you can sort of mould it to go where you want it to, and if all else fails and you don't like it, you can lift it off with a kneadable eraser. I found adding it directly to the page and then going in further with colour created a more bolder look, and I like that, and that's something I've learned about the personality of these paints. I kind of think all different paints that I use, different brands, different types, well, they've all got a different personality to them, don't you think? Now, the one thing that did surprise me, but then in hindsight it shouldn't have done, is the salt didn't work that brilliantly on here. Yes, you do get a bit of a texture, however, you're scraping off all that graphite. And maybe I need to experiment into that a little further by using different types of salt. I think something perhaps like a rock salt, where it's a bit chunkier and it's not going to scrape off as much underneath, might be a little better for it. I did find, again, these aren't quite as bold as the AliExpress paints, and again, that's okay, because you've got those different textures that are achieved with the graphite that's ground up inside it. I did find it a little harder to use when I was using the rigger brush, and I was using that on the painting when it had dried. And again, I think that's because the particles of graphite don't move around so great unless it's got that water to travel in. And I do believe I mentioned this on the video where I reviewed these paints. They don't quite, you get to a certain level of darkness with them and they just don't get any darker. And I think with the other watercolours that I use, the AliExpress and the ones I mix myself, you can get a much darker colour if you just keep layering it up. However, for me personally, I'm really happy with these. It's something a little different. It gets the old grey matter working, and I'm glad I got them. They might not be for everyone. I mean, I guess this colour palette in general is not for everyone, but I'm glad I've got them in my collection of watercolours and I can experiment. As you can see, I'm adding the details with the rigger brush, and I'm just finding it a little harder to get those smooth lines, and I'm having to go over them, and I suppose it's force of habit really to keep going over the same area to try and make it darker, but it just doesn't. But that's okay, I know that now, and I can utilise these paints in a more knowledgeable way. Now, I do have a little confession to make here. I edited the video and the end of this is cut off with this picture. The other one's fine. So unfortunately, we're going to get up to a point where there is just no more, and I am really sorry about that. However, I did get the main gist of this down, and if you want to see a full picture of me using these start to finish, I will leave a link in the description. But here's the finished result, and I like it, and I like its subtle charm. Now we're on to the Homebrew, and this is where it was trickier to mix a consistent amount of colours. I used a granulating black paint and a granulating blue paint from Daniel Smith. I believe it's the Lunar Blue and the Lunar Black, because I just thought they would work the best for this and I would achieve some nice effects there. And to add pigments, I used the Van Gogh ones, which I received in a scrawler box, and I believe the pink I used to create that red tone was a Winsor & Newton one. But if you're going to try this, I just recommend mixing them up until you get them to match, and that's the best advice I can give. And because I mixed them up and I wasn't mixing pans or anything, it was literally just mixing them in the palette, I struggled to make sure I'd got enough and to have a consistent amount. So there is a bit of a disadvantage there, but again, this is to prove it's possible, and maybe you don't need to buy either of the muted colours and you can create your own. Now for me, these are just like using a regular watercolour, only I've just customised them, I guess. I don't really like to mix a lot of colours up. I kind of like to use basic colours and mix them on the page, so let the colours flow into one another, or just buy the colour outright, because I tend to find, I don't know if it's just me, but I tend to find they can go a little bit muddy if I'm mixing to try and get a colour I want. And if there's a wide variety of colours to pick from where they're not going to go muddy and I can just use them straight away, why wouldn't I? Adding the salt again produced an effect I expected to, because I've done this before and I do like throwing a bit of salt on watercolours. It left a nice texture behind and nothing came off, and I was quite impressed with that. When it came to using the rigger brush, again it went on like a dream, as I expected it to. The only thing I found difficult, and again we've got limited colours to work with, is the skin tone, and again, that's down to over mixing, and I think it just looked a little bit muddy and a little bit flat, and it was just getting to a stage where I couldn't work into it anymore, but that's okay, it's okay. It was purely for experimental purposes, and I really wanted to share this video with you guys. So what I want to ask you guys is, are you finding these videos useful at all? Are they helping you with your artistic journey, or are they just satisfying a curiosity you might have? I'd really like to know in the comments. I do read them, and I can't say thank you enough for suggesting doing this as well. It was quite fun trying them out, and I hope the results from this have helped you in your choices with paints and watercolours in general. I did feel that towards the end of this painting that it was coming together once the details had come in, but I still think it's a little bit muddy, and maybe if I decide to do this again I might revise what I'm putting in the paints. That's if I need to. I do have 2 muted watercolour palettes, so maybe I just don't need to, and that's maybe an advantage to having one at hand. So we have all 3 of them on the left of the screen there. Let me know in the comments which one you think looks the best. I personally don't have a favourite. They all have their own qualities and charm about each one of them. If you found this useful, please let me know in the comments. And I want to say a thank you to you fabulous lot for watching this video, and if you have enjoyed it, please give us a like. If you're new here as well, don't forget to subscribe, and on the screen are a couple of videos that might help you pick out materials if you're looking to expand. I'll see you on the next one. Bye!